In this video, I'm going to be staining and finishing my cabinets. I have the carcasses all ready over there. I have the doors ready. I went ahead and put the hinge cups in all the doors, like you see. I have the drawers ready here. Everything has been sanded with 150 grit and made smooth as much as possible. This is my work area, just a scrap plywood. This is a paper composite, a drop cloth basically, not plastic that can be thrown away later. I have all the things that I need to stain. I have the staining pads and wiping clothes. I'm going to be using this most likely and not the pads. I have the foam brush and synthetic bristle painter's brush, and I have this couple of gloves and the stain and the pre-stain, something to stir, and I have this painter's pyramids that's pretty useful to hold the doors above the surface. Before I start staining, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the stains itself and the thinking behind this, different aspects of stains and pre-stains and top coats. Now, the world of stains and finishing can get complicated really fast. It's confusing. I'll put a couple of good articles in the description of the post that I thought was a good summary. But here, I don't want to get into all these complications or even scientific literature, like they use terms like nitrocellulose based, catalyzed, acrylic method, acrylic modified, etc. There's also different classifications like evaporative versus reactive or penetrating versus surface. I want to stay out of all that and keep things simple enough that any layman like me would understand what to do, what matters really in putting the stains and finishing. Starting with the basics, every piece of wood or furniture always has a protective layer on top of it. That protective layer is called a top coat or a finish. Sometimes it's called a clear coat. Sometimes it's also generally called varnish. Stain is different. If we stain the wood, it's generally to change the color of the wood. It doesn't protect the wood. So whether or not we put a stain, the top coat is always there. So one option is to stain the wood and then put a top coat on top of it, or we can put a top coat directly on top of the wood, which also slightly changes the color. In my cabinets, I'm going to put a stain. So if we put a stain, there's usually three layers. There's on top of the wood, we put a pre-stain, and then a stain, and then a top coat. If I decide not to put a stain, like I said, I can directly put a top coat on the cabinets. Now here's some examples of pre-stain, stain, and top coat. Why pre-stain? Because it helps to spread the stain more evenly. With certain kinds of wood especially, it helps with reducing blotchiness, blotches of stain on the wood, and it controls the grain raising. Why stain? Of course, like just for the color. And why top coat? It's mainly to protect what we have done with these two. Like I said before, I can directly put a top coat too. Now, whether we talk about stains or top coats, I think there are three categories where a layman like me has to pay attention. The first one is the type, the second one is the timing, and the third one is the method. Let's talk about the type first, and I'm going to mix, when I talk about types or these categories, I'm going to mix stains and top coat together. Now, there's several types of stains available. There's oil-based, water-based, and dye-based. But one important thing to remember is to always match. If we do stain, is to always match the pre-stain and stain. That means if the pre-stain is water-based, the stain should also be water-based. And if the pre-stain is oil-based, then the stain should also be oil-based. It doesn't have to match the top coat, but the pre-stain and stain must always match. That's important. Stain choice is, we don't really have to get into understanding oil and water and dye. It's mainly based on the color, because there are certain colors that I might like in an oil-based stain that may not be available in water-based, or vice versa. So really, it's the stain choice. It's mainly dictated by the color availability. And when we put the stain on a particular kind of wood, it could be an oak or maple. The color varies basically. So the same stain, unless it's a really dark stain, will look different based on whether it's on a fir, Douglas fir, or an oak, or something else. So it's always good to do a test batch before. Get a test, take a scrap wood of the same wood that, let's say, I would be making something with, and then do a test batch on that. What Rockler does is pretty helpful, because they give you, if you take the wood to Rockler, they can put stain whatever color you want in different colors, and they'll put it on that wood and let you see how it looks on that wood. And that's pretty helpful in choosing stain before you buy the whole lot. Same thing with the top coat. The top coat, they also come in oil and water based. And one important thing to remember is the top coat almost always has a tendency to alter the color tone, especially if the stain is lighter. Generally, polyurethane based finish is not, top coat is not recommended. A lot of people say that it turns into a sort of a banana color or yellowish amber sort of hinge, and it changes the color of the wood. Usually, urethane and polyacrylic based finish are better due to least ambering. This is the water-based top coat that I got from Rockler, which is the General Finishes brand. So that's about the type. In summary, it's mainly based on color availability. You have to make sure that the pre-stain and stain match, and understand that the top coat could change the color tone. The second factor is timing. We have to understand what the timing between these are. There's specific timing between when we apply the pre-stain and between wood stain. So I have a 30-minute window between pre-stain and wood stain, and then I have to wait about 24 hours at least before I put a top coat on. Those timings are important. Understand that if a pre-stain and stain are oil-based, then oil-based stain takes much more time to dry than water-based. So you have to wait at least three plus days before we apply the water-based top coat. Or if we apply, if the pre-stain and stain is water-based, then yeah, it's less dry time. So 24 hours is enough to put a top coat on. And that's why a lot of people prefer water-based, because it's much lesser dry time and easier to handle. Critical thing to remember is humidity is what affects the stain, the outcome of the stain, not the temperature. So usually when we stain, it's advisable to stain all the pieces together within a matter of 1 to 2 days, when the weather is somewhat similar in those 2-3 days. If there is an additional top coat, additional layers of top coat required, then it's always a good idea to dry it completely, dry the first layer completely before applying the next coat. All right. The third and the final category is the method. There's always a requirement to have a clean surface, and usually what I do is I use these mineral spirits that we get in any home store. I got this from Rockler. These mineral spirits are pretty good in cleaning up the wood before I apply the stain or the top coat directly. But even before the applying and cleaning the wood, the assumption is the wood is nicely sanded. So I use a couple of sanders that I have over here. One is a orbital sander, and the other one is a pad sander. Before I assemble any cabinets, I use 100 grit with my orbital sander. After the assembly, I used 150 grit. Some people go ahead and also go one step further and use 180 grit and 200 or 220 grit to sand. So at least 3 layers of sanding, 100 grit before assembly, and then 150 and 200, or about 200 or so, 2 more layers of sanding after assembly. Once the wood is sanded properly and cleaned up with mineral spirits, only then we are ready to put the stain in. The best way to apply stain is to apply with hand. Basically, the trick is to over apply and then wipe off. With multiple layers of coat, stain can go darker. So that's especially with darker colored stains. And with water-based top coat, it has better results if you use a power spray, electric power spray. And between, last point is between the top coats, when we have multiple layers of top coat, it's always advisable to sand it with a really high grit, 320 grit, so that the next top coat can latch on or catch on or hook on to the previous top coat properly. So that's it. These are the 3 considerations that any layperson can think about and understand while applying these stains and top coat. Now, the first step before anything else is to clean the wood up, and for that I use the mineral spirits. Once the wood is clean, you can see how much sand and dirt comes out of the wood. This is a really good way to make sure that the wood is clean and ready for the pre-stain and stain. If the stain is put directly on top of dirty wood, it's just not going to work out properly at the end. Now, whether I'm putting pre-stain or stain, I like to keep my surface horizontal instead of vertical to avoid any drippings and spillings. I like to start, it is recommended to start from the middle and then apply the coat on the left and right. Now I applied the pre-stain with the brush, and then I took a rag, a stained rag, and just lightly wiped off the excess. And I'm going to leave it like this for about half an hour or so, and then come back and put the stain on. So about 20 to 30 minutes have passed. I'm going to apply the wood stain now. Instead of using the brush, I'm going to use a foam brush, but the method is pretty much the same. But the trick to applying stain is to over apply it, to put more stain on it and make sure the stain reaches all the surface of the wood, and then we wipe it off. This over application and wiping off is supposedly the right method to apply any kind of stain. After the first coat of stain has dried for about an hour, which is by the way the recommended drying time for water-based stain, I can see these kind of lines or streaks basically that my rag has caused. So I'm going to be putting another coat of stain on top of this. It will probably make it a little bit more darker, but instead of using the rag, I'm going to be using this staining pads to wipe it off for the second coat. After the second coat has dried after an hour, it looks much better. I don't see any more of those streaks that I saw with the first coat. So I think the second coat with the staining pad is the way to go. One critical note about wiping is that the wiping has to be in the direction of the grain. It shouldn't be perpendicular, but it should be parallel in the direction of the grain. This here is the direction of my grain, so I wiped in this direction. Now I'm going to go ahead and stain the other spaces that I need to stain. I will not be staining the inside of the cabinet. Usually that's not recommended, but because it's just going to make everything look dark inside. So the stains are only going to be in the outer visible parts where I can see the cabinets basically from the outside. So I'm going to be staining those places now. I found out I was being a little bit careless with the strokes of my foam brush. Maybe I had a little too much stain, or I was stroking it too fast, but I had some splatter on the inside of the cabinet while I was working here. I also had some splatter in my drawers inside that were kept nearby. So lesson learned, to use the foam brush as lightly as possible with as little stain as possible in it, not too soaked, and also stroking it gently while staining. I'll try to sand it and clean it as much as I can, but these are outdoor cabinets. It's not a big deal for me. So I finished the carcasses, staining the carcasses. I'm going to move on to finish the doors. Same way, clean up, put the pre-stain and then the stain. I'm going to start with the top side, the back side of the door, because the front side of the door are sitting on the painter's pyramids. Once I finish this staining, I'm going to turn it over and do the front side of the door. That way, if I have any scratches from the tip of the pyramids, then it's going to be on the back side. It's going to scratch the back stain or the back side of the door and not the front. So the staining on the cabinet doors and the carcasses where they need to be stained is finished. I'm going to be moving on to applying my top coat or the protection layer. Before that, couple of closing thoughts. I've been using this foam brush to over apply the stain and then using rags to wipe off the stain. But if it's a flat surface, using rags is okay because you have a flat surface from the very top to the bottom. But when you have these 90-degree corners like that, it becomes very hard to wipe things off with flat surfaces. So I've been told by the expert in Rockler that I could use a bristle brush like this to wipe the stain off more effectively than using a cloth. The other second point to remember is to never sand a stain. I accidentally sanded this stained surface with 320 grit, and it took out a bunch of stain in spite of high grit. So the rule is to never sand on top of a stained surface. We can sand on top of a protected surface with top coat, but never sand on top of a stained surface directly. So that's it. I'll be moving on to my top coat. For that, I'll be setting up my HomeRite spray shelter, because I'll be using the power spray gun to put the protection layer on the top coat on, and it always helps to keep the spray particles contained when using a power spray. Here's the finished tent setup. I just transferred the table over here. I put the pieces inside, and there's a net over here that I can close the tent with. So I have the spray here ready. I'm using the Tack Life spray. I've already emptied the contents of my finish inside this box, and I had to play around with it. This box usually, or the can usually, tells you what should be the size of the spray. It says here about 1.1, 1.3 millimeter spray. I tried the 1 millimeter, didn't work that good, so I switched to 2 millimeter and reduced the flow to minimum. So we'll have to play around with it a little bit until I'm satisfied that I can get an even spray with an even outcome of the spray, basically. Not too much, not too less. So now I have found the sweet spot, and I'm going to stick with it and start spraying. This is another thing that I saw an extender in Rockler. It's used to increase the dry time. I thought I'll add that. You're supposed to add maybe 5 or 10% on top of this in the can itself, but I didn't want to increase the dry time, so I ended up deciding not using it. This is an option though. And of course I need my mask. I also got this from Rockler. So it's good to protect yourself from the particulates coming out of this. So I'm going to go ahead and do the top coat with this setup, finish it up. After every spray or coat, I'll close up the net and maybe leave it about 10-15 minutes without disturbing it. And then 10-15 minutes, since it's water-based, the advantage is it's dry enough for me to just pick it up and put it somewhere else to dry further. In between coats, I use this kind of sand block. It's not a sandpaper, this is a sandpaper. The sandpaper, even though it's a higher grit, will basically take off. It's too coarse, it will take off not only the top coat but also the stain. So this kind of sponge block should be used in between coats, just very lightly between coats before the next top coat is put on. So here's my pieces with all the top coat done, the finishing done. I had about 3 coats of finishing, especially on the outside, and 2 coats on the inside. And I had about an hour or 2 hour gap between each finish. So now I'm ready to go to the next steps, which is basically putting the drawer hardware and then putting it all together.